I hope it will add a layer to the sermon and things in the future that will help you as a whole. So I'm going to hopefully have that behind me and helping you follow along, not with like all the little nuances and points like we would do on a Wednesday night or Sunday school, but just some basic things and cross-references so that, sometimes you don't have enough time to actually turn there because we're going to read it and move on. And hopefully that will add something you can kind of follow along, as well as maybe some quotes and an occasional picture, those kinds of things. So we're going to try this. I'd appreciate your feedback afterward. If you're like, does that add to it? Does it take it away? Feel it out a little bit, and then we'll go from there. So we'll see how this works out for us. But if you would, open your Bibles to James chapter 3, verse 5. James chapter 3, verse 5. And we're going to, really, this is part 2 from what we started with just last week and looking at the tongue and whatnot. So, James chapter 3, verses 5 through 12. Smokey the Bear, you're probably familiar, although you might not realize that that's not actually his name. It's actually just Smokey Bear. The was added in a song at some later point. But he turns 78 this year. I think he looks pretty good for 78. Not a lot of gray going on. But he was started as part of an ad campaign back in, or at least the concept was started back in 1944 as part of an ad campaign put forth actually by the War Department. The War Department realized that they had a problem. Back in 1942, the Japanese had kind of launched a few things from the Pacific there, and it was dangerously close to the woods and wooded area of the Pacific Northwest and that area, and down even further into California. And what the War Department realized was there was a real danger in them actually starting ablaze the massive forests that were over there. The problem with that is not only would it be terrible to lose that as a whole, the beauty and everything that's contained in there, but the overall natural resource that was. Plus, we've seen in recent months how hard that is to put out, and all the firefighters and people that would be tasked with putting it out are overseas in the war effort. It would be devastating to this country. And so they realized they needed something that they could make citizens hyper-vigilant, not only to prevent any of the Japanese forces or others to do something like that, but also that there would not be some careless, reckless camper or somebody starting a fire that we didn't really have the ability to put out. And so this campaign was started. What's funny is that Smokey Bear was not actually the first choice or the first spokesperson for this campaign. You may not realize it, but Bambi was, just for a year, because Disney only gave the rights to him for a year, and after that they had to start over. So Smokey the Bear was created, and his first slogan was this: Smokey says, care will prevent 9 out of 10 woods fires. And I'm like, wow, that is so not, doesn't flow, it's clunky, but thankfully it was replaced in 1947 with, remember, only you can prevent forest fires. What is strange today is the fact that people debate the overall effectiveness of that campaign. It did wonders as far as eliminating the overall forest fires and wildfires that are going on. At the same time, it got people to think that any type of fire for any reason was wrong. And now all of that underbrush and stuff that normally would be burned off periodically and kept overall low in quantity now has ballooned up, so that now when you have these fires, you have massive fires that burn hundreds of thousands of acres every year and are devastating because they're totally out of control and they can't get contained. In fact, here's a picture from just a few weeks ago in Colorado, and this wasn't necessarily a woods fire as much as it is a grass fire. And so this is a development. Actually, my aunt and uncle live not that far from here. They were almost ready to evacuate, but this is this subdivision. This is before, and this is after the grass fires came through. And I know it's hard to see a little bit, but basically, just imagine all of this in ash. And all these little black spots are houses that are gone, and the ash piles that are around each of all these houses, but it's gone. It just burned right through these neighborhoods, and hundreds and hundreds of homes were destroyed based on these wildfires, these grass fires that took place. And every year we hear about some of those things going on in the news, and part of that is because of the fact that these fires never go on. But what that helps illustrate is something that James would be very sympathetic towards, is the absolute destructive nature of fire and the things that it can do. There is a reason why James uses this idea, this illustration, to make his point very vividly in this passage. But you think about most of those fires are started by something that was so small. That in and of it, in the moment, it seemed inconsequential. Whether it was a match of people that were having just a nice campfire, just enjoying themselves, didn't seem like that big of a deal, and they just failed to put it out, or failed to put it out completely, and it's just allowed to smolder just a little bit. Or a lightning strike, or sometimes we hear of downed wires, seemingly small. It's not that big of a deal. Like we could hold those in our hands, we could see them, and it strikes just a little small spot on the ground. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal, and then you see something like this, and you realize how small it was when it started, and then it takes up over and goes so far, so much larger than what it started with. It's amazing. And James is telling us here the tongue is much the same way. It starts often with something that is very small, the tongue, the things that we say, and yet it rages out of control sometimes. And there's nothing you can do but just stand there and watch it and the devastation that ensues, and wondering how or when it will ever stop. Last week we spent a lot of time looking just at the responsibility that we have for the things that we say. James is not going to undo that whatsoever this week. You are still responsible, but this is what can happen. Smokey might tell you that only you can prevent forest fires, but James is going to tell you that only you can prevent hellfire because of the way in which he views the tongue. Really, if we could boil this down in just a simple phrase, I think it would simply be this: that think before you speak, because words have amazing destructive power. And keep in mind here that destructive power isn't just focused on the world around you. It will destroy you as well. You're not immune even from your own words, the things and the power they can have and exude over you, the consequences that can happen. It very much affects you directly, as well as people that are outside and around you. So our passage breaks down actually pretty cleanly into two, I'm going to call them key truths. You can maybe break them down in some other way, but the truth is that the tongue is a carnivorous monster and a confusing mixture. Let's read verses 5 through 8, and hopefully it'll be behind me as well. He says, "So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison." The tongue is a carnivorous monster. This first 5 verses, or several verses here, and it really becomes an understatement when we talk about it that way. But as James is going into this, he says here, and really we're looking at the latter half of verse 5 here, but he says, the tongue is such a small thing in comparison to the rest of the body. And it really is. I don't know if we could break the body down into various percentages, but I question if it would really even add up to 1%, or maybe only barely 1%. And yet it can set off an entire firestorm of activity in the world around us in just a moment. Just like a fire that catches and all of a sudden is wildly out of control, our tongue can set forth a series of motions or words that can come out of our mouth, and all of a sudden a firestorm ensues of people. Is that those words land on the ears of those around us, and we start something, we begin something, and it can truly set ablaze all aspects of our lives. He calls it a fire, an entire world of unrighteousness. We understand that fire can be a very useful tool. It really allows us to be in here and as comfortable as we are right now, because fire in the furnaces are heating the room. We cook our food with fire and heat. We are able to forge with it, make things with it, and the countless other things that have been accomplished because of fire, the ability to heat something. And James isn't taking away any of those things, but what his focus on in this passage is clearly the destructive nature and power of fire, because we realize that when fire gets out of control, it destroys. It always does destroy. And you think about all the ways that you can sin with your tongue, and the various ways that maybe you've felt the consequences of that. Maybe you haven't, hopefully not, but I'm sure you probably have. And you start thinking okay, what are the ways that we can sin with our tongue? James, for whatever reason, doesn't get explicit. Maybe he just felt like he didn't need to, or maybe just because he didn't want to pigeon himself in a way that you never broadened the scope of that to just what he would say. But I think we can very easily pick out some other ones. And the first one I thought about is just violating the third commandment. Exodus 20, verse 7 says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." In our cultural moment, it has become so easy to just say things like, "Oh my God," or to abbreviate in some kind of a text form like OMG. And I don't think, if you tell people, "Hey, you just took God's name in vain," I think they would look at you like, "What do you mean?" I don't think it registers anymore. There was a time where that wasn't true. The people wouldn't say even something as simple and that as, "Oh my God," in any way, shape, or form, or OMG, because they just wouldn't do that. And it has become so prevalent that I don't think most people even think that they're cursing when they say that. And yet they're violating the third commandment clearly. They're taking God's name in vain. And it has become such an empty phrase and such a common phrase. And they don't even like bleep that out on like even shows and things meant and designed for kids where you would not say any other curse word. But that one is part of the vernacular. And it's so devoid, and it affects all of us, because I think you get to a passage like Psalm 3:7, and you start reading this one, "Arise, O Lord, save me. Oh my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked." It's hard to say that any other way. We don't say like, "Arise, O Lord." It feels different. When you get to those next three words, "Save me, oh my God," it's hard to include the reverence of that verse is due, that our God is due, but we've all been affected and changed by this. Now, correct me if I'm wrong afterwards, like, I don't think like that. Maybe that's true. But I think we are the products of our environment. You can't live here in this cultural moment and think that you are entirely and immune from that, and that it does not even affect the way the tone and the way in which you say those words, the way that they come out and the way they just sound to you. It sounds odd to me in that verse. And I think in some ways, aspects, it's almost like ruined the way that I can read and understand that verse. Not that I'm cursing when I'm reading it, but it's just the tone and the inflection that comes out when I say that. It's like I don't even know how to do that without sounding like I'm taking God's name in vain, or the way that the culture would. But that's what's happened. Because people have not guarded their tongues. It might not feel like that big of a deal to you, but that's only because then you look at the Exodus 20 verse 7 has maybe gotten obscured for you, and to realize this is the name of God, and it is something that is not to be taken lightly. Vacuum all of the sense of meaning out of it. It wasn't. Yet it's happened. Another one here is lying and slander. Proverbs 10:18 says, "The one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool." Those two often get lumped together. Lying is just simply not telling the truth. I think we know that that's going to be wrong, and even the world is going to recognize that as wrong. But slander sometimes, or libel, might be a little bit more difficult to kind of figure out or ascertain in that. But, doing that is you're really trying to change the way that people think about someone else. And so it might not even involve telling a lie there. You can tell the truth in order to communicate the truth, or you can tell the truth in ways to make somebody look bad. The way you spin or twist it, something along those lines. You can easily do that because you're trying to destroy someone's character or their reputation. It probably does involve a lie, or sometimes just an omission of the truth. But that's a sin of the tongue. It's a sin of the tongue. And we have to be careful that we don't fall guilty of that, because it is very easy sometimes, especially when we omit the truth, right? We just won't give them the whole picture. We won't tell them all of it, because we'll try to paint a picture where we look good or that person looks bad. We're trying to obfuscate or change something, but it's wrong. Another one was gossip. Proverbs 26:22. "The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into the inner parts of the body." I kind of like that verse. It's the mental picture of the whole thing, like delicious morsels. And let's be honest. I think maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I think we've all had people come up to you and say, "Hey, did you hear the latest?" And they start telling you something, you're like, "Ooh, do tell." Right? Grapevine Gladys comes over and she's got a hot, juicy story about someone that you know, and she wants to tell you something, and you want to listen in. And it's like it says, it's a delicious morsel. It's appealing to the ear, and we want to hear that. We want to know that. And it might not be a lie, and it might not even be slander. It might all be true, but does it need to be said? Maybe it's something that was said in confidence. Maybe it was something that will, maybe very, very true, but will make this person look good. It won't necessarily be slander, but it won't make them look good, or will cut them down in some other aspect. A lot of these things, there's overlapping ideas here. Or sometimes you're just looking for something to talk about. You say, I don't know what to say. Well, let's talk about somebody. And we do. Another one is anger. It might not be like specifically the sin of the tongue per se. It doesn't have to be specifically a sin of the tongue, but yet how often is it expressed with the tongue that we are upset with someone and we start yelling and screaming and saying things that we probably shouldn't say. Proverbs 15:18 again says, a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. Hot-tempered man stirs up strife. How do you think that happens? They open their mouth and they say things that they ought not to say, or that are cutting on purposefully, and stirs up strife. Another one is just arrogance or pride. It's all too common and easy to do. You can boast about how humble you are. Figure that one out. Our achievements, our abilities, and this has gotten people in trouble. And let's be honest, it's not attractive to be around someone that just simply always talks about themselves and props themselves up. It says, I'm so much better than, it may not even be you, but I'm so much better than them. I'm better at this. I'm better, and we do that. And Proverbs 18:12 says, before destruction, a man's heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor. If you really think this of yourself, it will not be long until you say this of yourself. And it changes the things that you act, what you do, because you've already changed the way you think about yourself. All of these things, and there's probably more. These are the ones I kind of thought up on the top of my head, and I thought there's probably a lot more of these. But you get the idea. There's so many ways that there are to sin with your tongue in some aspect, and these can be devastating. Just the ones we've listed can be devastating, and sometimes harder than a forest fire to put out. Have you ever tried to track down like a rumor? Somebody says something about you, like, where did this come from? And you're like, no, that's not true. And you try to explain yourself. And it just like lives on. And you'll hear people, like from time to time, and it'll come up, or people will say something. And it's even worse now because that thing can live forever online. And then you try to put that thing out there, and like nobody believes you. No, that's not true. This is what really happened. You're like, I don't know, because I read it over here somewhere. It's not. How do you put it out? At least with a forest fire, you put that thing out, you know that it's out. Right? At some point, it's going to stop steaming, and it's going to be covered up. You can put sand on. You can do all kinds of things to that, and actually look at it. It's finally out. It may have destroyed thousands of acres, but at least it's out. How do you know when a rumor is out? How do you know when a lie has been sufficiently repudiated or put down? How do you know? You don't. And they can come back sometimes even years later, and people start talking. People start saying other things like, oh, I got to live with this now. Because somebody said something about you, or maybe something you said took on a life of its own and went elsewhere. That old adage, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Have you ever said that before? It's rare, but that's a statement that's both true and false at the same time. There's an aspect of that is true, the fact that words will only hurt you if you let them. It's especially what you're trying to communicate to kids when they're like, oh, they called me a moron. Well, it's not true unless you believe it. And there's also that aspect where, it's amazing to me sometimes talking to adults. And they've made choices in their lives. They have sometimes sins, sometimes just habits of thinking. And you're like, what happened? And you dig down far enough and dig down deep enough, and you realize because somebody said something to them as a kid that they owned. And it haunts them. for the rest of their adult life. And whoever said it to them, whether it was a parent or a teacher or first employer, like it could be 1,000 things in there, but the first person that said that to them and did that to them never meant them to own that. Never meant them to own that. And yet they do. And it sets them on a path and a direction that just almost enslaves them, and they just can't get past because things are never good enough. Things are, these people don't love me, or I can't do anything right. And they own this. And you're like, why do you think this way? Why are you going in these directions? Like, well, and they can't even put it together, but you talk to them long enough and you realize, oh man, you have to be so careful about the things that you say to your kids and how they come across and what you mean by them and all of this, because, man, they own it sometimes. And you're like, oh, it's devastating. But so is the things that we say with our tongue to everybody. They are all devastating. This next bit, and we're really only in verse 6 here, don't let that scare you, but this next bit James uses to underscore really the destructive nature of the tongue even further. Not just the sins that we can commit. And understand, this is not a simile. James is not saying the tongue is like a fire. He's not saying it's like a fire. He just says it is a fire. It is a fire. At the beginning of verse 6 there, and the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. I don't think James could get any more graphic here if he wanted. It's not exactly easy to understand all the nuances that James is really trying to get out here in verse 6 and how they all fit together, because he's got some phrases here that are unique and interesting. A world of unrighteousness. The tongue is a world of unrighteousness. I think the NIV maybe helps us here. They've kind of like chewed this up a little bit in how they formulate what they think it sounds like, and I think this is helpful. And that should be behind me. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. I mean, that verse should make your blood run cold. If you really think about what he is saying here and trying to communicate, there's a sense in which he's talking about the tongue as being almost an entire ecosystem of evil dwelling in the middle of your face, directly connected to your heart, spewing all kinds of things out there that ought not to be said. And he's not saying that we can't sin with any other part of our body. That's important. James is not saying like everything that you do, all the sins that you ever commit are all coming from your mouth. You're not. You can sin with your hands. You can sin with your feet. You can sin with all aspects of your body. But you want to talk about the most concentrated place where the most evil dwells and will be committed by you over the course of your lifetime. It's not your hands. It's your mouth. That's what he's ultimately saying here. It lives there. And it changes how we treat people, how they treat us, how they see us, and do this. You think about all the altercations that people have in life. How do they start? There's a good portion of you guys that are going to go home this afternoon and you'll turn on a football game. Nothing wrong with that. But you'll turn on a football game, and inevitably this scene will play out in some aspect. There will be some kind of bedlam going on, some misunderstanding, something like flags will fly, and they're like, okay, something's going on over here, and they'll zoom in on an area of the field, and they'll do the instant replay, and you see like guys are shoving each other and pushing each other, all this stuff. How did that start? Inevitably, as the game was wearing on, there were missed opportunities, a team is getting frustrated, things aren't going very well, and what happens? They zoom in, and what happens? A play happens, the guy gets up, turns his face, and starts talking. Takes the other player, and next thing they're shoving each other and throwing. I mean, what was it, a year ago that one guy took his helmet off and just started wailing on a guy? Do you remember that? It was crazy. And you're like, how did that start? Because he opened his mouth. And if it's your team, you're like, no, stop. Because inevitably, you know the flag is going to come, penalties are going to come flying. And once in a while, not always, but once in a while, I mean, the penalties that get handed down, they change the outcome of the game. And you're like, just keep your mouth shut. Stop talking. But what happens? Mouth opens up and fists start flying. Do you see how one thing leads to another, leads to another? He says it sets your entire course of your life on fire. See it? The mouth opens up and fist raise up. That's what he's talking about. Like, it doesn't just stop here with our mouths. It keeps going, and everything else kind of follows suit. That's what he's talking about. Like, it's coming from the heart, but it starts with the mouth and then ensues to all other aspects of the body. That's why if you've got your tongue under control, your tongue is bridled, all those other sins from verses 1 through 5 that we were looking at, mentioned last week, he says they're already under control. If you can get your tongue under control, all those other, like pornography and lust and desire and wickedness and theft and all the other things you could throw in there, if you've got your tongue under control, those are under control. They're all connected. And they all lead to one thing or another. That's what he's ultimately talking about here. And then he goes on, he says this thing, he says the tongue is actually set on fire from hell. It's hellfire. That's a unique look. It's what's going on here. And the word he uses there is kind of an unusual one. Jesus used it, but really nobody else does. But it's actually the word Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom, is a specific place. And I think I mentioned this to you, but when I was at Northland, we had a Gehenna. Where I went to college, we had one. And it was just this giant burn pile. We would cut down trees all the time, or trees would fall down, we'd cut them up, and we would sell the wood part for we had pulp and we had bolts, I think it was called. We'd sell that, but all the branches, they got to go somewhere. And so we had this huge pile in the middle of a field, and it only got burned probably right about this time of year because there was snow on the ground, it was cold, and it would burn for days. But we would take dump trucks out there in wagons, and we even had an old log truck. Dave would appreciate that one. We had an old, it was like a Ford L8000 log truck. It was my first manual transmission I ever drove. Go figure. And so, but you understand the size of this pile that we would have. It was huge. But it was where all the refuse and all the garbage, all the trimmings from these trees would go here. And then it would burn, and it would just burn and burn and burn and burn and burn. Jerusalem has one of those too. But it's bigger. To the west and to the south, it was in the Valley of Hinnom, an actual valley that was there. And it was a place, it was a terrible place, it was a horrible place, because years prior, many, many years prior to this, the Moabites, and because they were neighbors, they always drugged the Jews into this, had offered a lot of sacrifices there, child sacrifices there, and various kings from Judah and even probably Israel participated in some of those events, sacrificing these children on these altars to the gods. Finally, King Josiah, in his reign, he's cleaning everything else up. He defiled that area so that would never happen again. And the way he did it was he just started throwing all the trash there. Trash in a sacred place, no more sacred place. And it was a place where all this refuge and all this stuff would go. So when Jesus talks about where the worm dies not, the maggots and all this stuff, he's really referring to some of the things that were going on and that you would find to see rotting, animal carcasses and other things that were going on there, just stuff that was burning and fires would pop up from time to time. It was never really out, but it was an unclean place. It was a horrible place. And James is really trying to communicate for us here, like your tongue is on fire, and it's on fire from a place like that. It's like almost literally a dumpster fire. And the destruction that comes because of a result of that. That's what he's trying to express. Now we all know the tongue doesn't have to be that way, but it often is. But he's driving home this point incredibly hard. And we all know the veracity of it, that it is so easy to use our tongues more often to destroy than to construct. It's far easier to destroy than to build. And it can happen so quickly that we might not even realize we're doing it until we've already done it, because it just comes out. He keeps going here now in verse 7. And he talks about really what amounts to a menagerie, as he's talking about all the beasts and the birds and things that are going on in here. And a menagerie, kind of a zoo, he just starts listing off these animals that he knew of. And certainly every animal that James would have known of in his day and age had been tamed to some capacity, one form or another. And even today, we can think of various animals that people have trained, like things that you would never want to have as a pet, or just couldn't have as a pet. You go down to SeaWorld, what do you see? Killer whales, orcas, all those kinds of things doing tricks. And it's amazing. You're like, wow, you wouldn't think that was possible. Flippers down there, all those kinds of things. Then you've got, the snake charmers, specifically in India. They got the cobras coming out of their little baskets, and they're playing with these, and you're like, you are crazy. But they play with those things. They do those things. I kind of wonder if like James had a parrot or something. He taught it to speak or something like that. People have trained and taught all kinds of animals to do all kinds of things. He said it's possible. And especially in the day and age in which we live, we recognize more and more how possible that really is, that you can train animals to do all kinds of things. But he says, the one thing that nobody can actually tame, the one thing that nobody can actually train, is your tongue. It's easier to train a king cobra than it is to train your tongue. Think about that. Why is it? He says because it's full of poison. It's uncontrollable. It's restless, he says. The best metaphor I can think of this is kind of like a sea, because it goes back and forth. See, on any given day, you go out to the sea or even some of the Great Lakes and other places, large bodies of water. You go out there, and there are times where it is smooth as glass. It's beautiful. Reflects the sunrise or the sunset. You can go out there and just no worries. It's just, putt around in your little boat and have fun. It's great. And you go back a day or two later, in the middle of a storm, and the waves are so high, you'd have to be crazy to go out there. So how do you define the sea? Is it calm or is it tempestuous? Well, it's kind of all of those things. Depends on the day. But you never know what you're going to get. And every day there's literally thousands of sailors and thousands of ships navigating the seas, and sometimes things are fairly smooth, and sometimes they're afraid for their lives. What the Bible would call that is the sea is kind of a double-minded man. It's unstable in all of its ways. It's chaotic. And too often our tongues are the same way, but they ought not to be. They ought not to be that way, but they often are. It's the only way, the best way I can describe that. The tongue becomes this unstable thing. It is untamable. And so we begin to understand a little bit more the destructive power of the tongue, that it knows no bounds and it is not tamed. And I'm sure we've all been on the giving end, but also the receiving end of that. However, James is not done, because he really wants to share how inconsistent this really is. Especially for those who you claim to be in Christ. You should not be unstable in all your ways. You should not resemble the sea. You should not be like this at all. You should be consistent. People should know what they are getting. But obviously, James is writing this. That's not the way it is. But it says the way it should be. Let's read verses 9 through 12, hopefully behind me. There it is. It says, "With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water." The tongue ultimately is a confusing mixture. What he's really doing is going through this clear dichotomy. But how is it that you think that you can bless the Lord and then curse those who are made in his image? That doesn't make any sense. But that's what he's ultimately saying. You're inconsistent with this whole thing. We as believers should understand that better than anyone. If you are made in the image of God, how can you do something to someone that you would never do to God? And yet we all do it all the time. We would probably, I hope, never curse God. Yet we curse those made in his image. We would never, I hope, lie to God. Yet we lie to those who are in his image. We would never slander God, I would hope, but we slander those who are made in his image. We are inconsistent. Blessing and cursing are coming out of our mouths. We're talking out of both sides of our mouths, as people sometimes say. We're double-minded. We're inconsistent. All of those examples that James lists here are impossible scenarios. We're not going to go through them one by one, because he's illustrating really the same point over and over again. Olives and grapes can't come from the same tree. Blessing and cursing shouldn't come from the same person. Freshwater and saltwater can't come from the same spring. Two antithetical things cannot come. One will always win out. You will be one or the other, but you can never be both. Back in 1850, there was a man by the name of John Snow. Over in England, specifically in London and kind of an area near London. And he was kind of a pioneering fellow, if you maybe don't recognize his name, but he really pioneered a scientific method in trying to isolate and understand disease and the spread of disease. And the disease that he was working with at the time was something called cholera. Terrible, terrible disease. It originated in India and had kind of worked its way through Europe and eventually found its way to England. And he had dealt with it when he was a kid. When he was younger, he had been apprenticed to a doctor and failed to really get a grasp and actually help people. It just eventually kind of died out. But it would rear its head from time to time. And cholera is this terrible thing because you would get it and you could have a perfectly healthy person just almost literally walking down the street and suddenly be onset with just terrible, debilitating stomach pains, just massive vomiting coming out, and then usually coming through the other end at some point too, and you would die sometimes in as soon as 24 hours, not necessarily from the disease itself, but from extreme dehydration. And I was just talking about over there, but I think they said you were expelling sometimes 20 liters of water in 24 hours. You can't drink enough to make up for that. And in 1850, they didn't understand any of these things. And they thought it was something in the air, that people were breathing. And John Snow was looking at this, and the information is that doesn't make sense. And they thought he was crazy. And he kept trying to investigate. No. And he started finding out, okay, there's a huge concentration of people in this area. What do they have in common? And he started zeroing in on the water supply rather than the air supply. And he kept zeroing in as what's different between this water supply that people are getting sick and this one over here that they're not. And he kept going back and forth and realized that the raw sewage in the area was getting itself into the fresh water supply, sometimes from the river itself, sometimes from the freshwater wells that were dug in the ground that people were using. And he was finally able to isolate the Broad Street well. And he told the health department at the time, like, I think this is the problem. And they said, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. And he begged them, and he did all kinds of research, literally knocking on doors. Where do you get your water from? What do you do? Why are you not sick and everybody else is around you? And he kept putting dots because that person got water from over here. These people literally only drank beer. All these weird and strange, but he kept being able to explain away the outliers of why these people were getting sick and these ones weren't. And eventually the health department said, okay, we'll humor you. So they took the handle off the Broad Street well. 3 to 4 days later, no new cases. And they still didn't believe him. They said, no. It's something in the air that's just revolving around the Broad Street well. Finally, a clergyman got involved in this and started interviewing a lot of the people, his parishioners that were there, and together they came to the conclusion, like, no, there's sewage here. And they traced it back to a sick child whose diaper got thrown into the cesspool underneath the house that was leaking directly into the well that fed this massive area of people. He figured it out. Why do I use that illustration? Because the life-giving water that was coming out of that well was also giving death-causing cholera at the same time. Guess which one won out? See, the well couldn't be both. It could produce both things. There was certainly life-giving water, but there was also cholera. It was also tainted well. It could only do one thing. It became a well of death, not a well of life. James is saying you can't do this. If you are going back and forth, if you are a double-minded man, unstable in all your ways, there's something inherently wrong with you. And you're not being consistent. You're not following after God. You can't be both. You're one or the other. It's very much a black and white ideology or idea that he's trying to put forward here. And too many people, they're looking for gray. They want to be the exception. They want to say, yeah, but I can kind of do that. I can be part of that. And once in a while something will fly out. And James is like, no. You should not be okay with that. Now, are we going to be perfect in this life? Absolutely not. But should we be improving? Yes. Absolutely. And that's what James is after. He says, I know you're not going to be perfect. I know you're not going to get this right. But at least try to do something. At least show that you are created, that you are being made more and more into the image of Christ. And if you are made more and more in the image of Christ, you should be changing and you should be growing in your life. That always begs the question, how? And I think there's a clear cure, at least a hint of one here. Look at verse 8. It's not going to be behind me, but look in verse 8. Very beginning. But no human being can tame the tongue. That stuck out to me right away. No human being can tame the tongue. Now, some people downplay that and say, well, he's just being very deliberate here, but he doesn't mean anything more than nobody can tame the tongue. I don't buy it. Human being, sure. No one, it's not the same thing. God can. Bridle the tongue. And how does he do it? By bridling the heart. God can do this. James, I don't think, spent the first 5 verses of this passage detailing the responsibility that each and every one of us have for the words that come out of our mouth to then sit back and say, well, you can't really do anything. I think we are supposed to put in the work. Now, any progress, any growth in these areas that we have to give credit where credit is due. God is working in us and doing this. But at the same time, he's saying, put in the effort, work, do things. So how? How do we do this? And I don't think it's simply a let go and let God. All right, God, just fix me. No. Put in the work. And I think here's some of the things that we can do. And some of these are a little bit repeat from last week, but not all of them. One, I think, is just cutting off bad influences. Cutting off bad influences. 1 Corinthians 15:33 talks about this. He says, do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. You cannot underestimate the influence of those people that are around you, whether they are friends, our entertainment choices, our social media, sometimes even family and so forth. All of those influence your heart. Therefore, it matters. And it will manifest itself in what you say. The one thing that we should be spending more time with, or one person we should be always spending more time with is God. And that will change the way that you think because He's changing your heart. And when you have a heart change and a heart growth, guess what comes out of your mouth? Change. It makes a difference. It does absolutely make a difference. And we sit and we put all these things in front of ourselves and thinking, oh, it doesn't affect me. It does. It does absolutely affect you. I think we could turn that verse inside out and say it this way. Good company improves good morals. It does. Don't downplay those that are around you and understand that there may be some things, sometimes things, or sometimes even people that you just like, we have to cut this off. I can't have this as part of my life. It has to be cut off. It can't be part of my life anymore, or at least for a time. I think another one is recognize that your social media presence is your presence. I don't quite understand it. Studies have been done to try to understand this a little bit, but there seems to be something where the inhibitions of things that we do online versus in real life are removed. That we can exist a certain way online and do things online, say things online that we would never do in person, but online we go like, it doesn't matter. It's like it's not the real me. Like we're living in the metaverse that Facebook all wants us to have. Like this whole new thing, what happens there stays there. That's not a thing. That we should be consistent here and there and to recognize that if I'm saying things out there that I wouldn't say to someone's face here, I shouldn't say it there. You're not brave online, you're a coward in real life. We have to understand that there needs to be a consistency here, that's not okay, that's just as much me, and James would tell you, you're just as responsible for what happens online in any platform or forum as I am here. So stop breaking those things apart and cutting your life into bits and pieces and separating them and saying, that doesn't matter, that does. It all matters. It all matters. Gossip, slander, and libel, I think a lot of the sins of the mouth that kind of fall in these categories, I think sometimes fall into it because we're trying to find a sense of value and identity or worth from other people. So we put them down so we feel better about ourselves. We're trying to find an identity and a value and a worth, and we're having a hard time finding it. I think it's one of the biggest dangers with, again, a lot of the social media platforms where we're trying to, nobody seems to care who we are in real life on our little circle, in our little group, so we try to get that from people online because all of a sudden we're somebody and we're important and we're meaningful. And then we like to put people down. We can't do that. We need to remember all of us are members of the human race, which means that all of us are made in the image of God. And if you're looking for identity and value and worth, then look no further than the fact that you are a son or a daughter of God. There's your identity. There's your value. There's who you are in Christ. That will fill in all the boxes. That ticks all the boxes. That's who you are. And I think that when you feel confident about who you are in your identity in Christ, then all those other things, they start taking their place. But if you struggle with those kinds of things, then maybe like have to entertain the idea like, why am I struggling? Do I just not value who I am in Christ? Or is there another reality where I am nobody in Christ? I'm not his child. I'm not a son or a daughter of God. Then that's where it starts, because none of these other things will ever happen. None of these other things will work. You're just thinking, I'm going to bite my tongue. It won't work. You have a sore tongue maybe at the end of the day, but it won't be a better one. I think the other one, last one I have anyway, is just simply prayerfulness. We probably could have started with that one, but I don't know if there's anything more important here than this. Asking God not just to help you, although you should, but make you aware. To take a few minutes, Lord, and just help me become aware of ways in which I might be violating what James is insinuating here. And then wait for it. And watch what happens. And then all of a sudden you start opening your mouth. And I think this will happen. Maybe to some of you, maybe more than others, but I think this will happen. You're like, all right, Lord, show me places that I'm violating this. Show me places that I'm falling short with this. And you might be amazed at the lies coming out of your mouth. You might be amazed at the gossip coming out of your mouth. You might be amazed at the slander that's coming out of your mouth. You're like, where is all this coming from? Well, it was probably always there. You just didn't realize it. And unfortunately, I think that's probably true for a lot of us. Like, all of us. We're just not aware. We just don't pay attention. All of a sudden, like, hey, I kind of framed that wrongly or poorly. I shouldn't have said that. I think all of us would be amazed, not only that we're guilty of this, but how often we're guilty of this. We're double-minded. We're trying to be life-giving, as in following the Lord, and at the same time, there's nothing but death and hellfire coming out of our mouths. You know, at the end of the day, all of this is easier said than done, and I know that. James knows that, because again, he said, remember, if you've got your tongue under control, then everything else in your life probably already is. This is a hard, hard thing that he's asking for us here. It is truly one of the most unwieldy members of the body. That's why he takes so much time. He says it's on fire. It's hellfire. What's between your mouth is hellfire. It hurts everyone. But don't let that be an excuse to let it run wild. It will hurt those you love. It will hurt you. It will defame the name of Christ. Instead, take the time and ask God to help you work on bridling, ultimately, your heart. And the tongue will follow suit, so that we can bear the kind of fruit that is characteristic of one who is in the vine of Christ. Let's pray. Lord, as we have studied this passage now 2 weeks, and looking at the response